My name is Vincent Delacroix, and I'm a toymaker who survived the first 90 days when volcanic ash blocked out the sun and froze the world solid. Within weeks, summer became deadly winter. Children died in their bedrooms. I had to choose between crafting beautiful toys or keeping kids alive in a frozen shelter with 2,000 desperate survivors. My wooden animals became the difference between hope and madness when civilization collapsed around us. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comments section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. My name is Vincent Delacroix, and what I'm about to tell you happened during the summer that never came back. July 15th, 2024. I remember that date because it was the last normal day of my life, the last day I worked in my garage workshop on Southeast Hawthorne Boulevard in Portland, Oregon, believing that children would grow up in a world where summer meant warmth and safety. I was sanding the mane of a wooden rocking horse that morning, running my fingers along the smooth cedar grain, making sure every curve was perfect. The horse was a commission for Emma Rodriguez, a 7-year-old who lived 3 houses down from me. Her parents had ordered it for her birthday in August, and I was taking my time with it because Emma had specifically asked for a horse that looked like it was dancing. She wanted flowing hair and a gentle expression, something that would make her feel safe when she climbed on its back. The sun was streaming through my workshop windows, and I had them wide open because July in Portland usually meant pleasant warmth, not the oppressive heat you get in other parts of the country. Mrs. Chen next door was out in her garden, watering her tomato plants and humming some tune I didn't recognize. Her granddaughter was helping her, a little girl maybe 5 years old who always waved at me when I was working. Normal stuff. The kind of ordinary summer morning that you take for granted until it becomes impossible. I had been making toys for 15 years by then, learned the craft from my grandfather who came over from France in the 1950s. He used to tell me that a toy wasn't just something to keep a child busy. It was a promise that the world still had room for wonder and beauty. He would say that in his thick accent, tapping his weathered finger on whatever piece I was working on. A child without wonder is already dead inside. He would remind me whenever I got frustrated with a difficult carving or when customers complained about my prices. My workshop was everything to me. I had converted the garage of my small house into this perfect space where I could lose myself for hours. Hand tools hung on pegboards my grandfather had helped me install. Chisels, carving knives, sanders, all arranged exactly where I could reach them without thinking. Shelves lined the walls, filled with finished pieces waiting for pickup and works in progress that I would return to when inspiration struck. The smell of wood shavings and Danish oil filled the air constantly, and I had grown so accustomed to it that I didn't notice it anymore unless I left for a few days and came back. I specialized in handcrafted wooden toys. Dollhouses with working doors and tiny furniture, pull toys with wheels that actually rolled smoothly, puzzles cut so precisely that the pieces fit together with a satisfying click, music boxes with hand-carved figures that danced when you wound them up. Every piece took weeks or sometimes months to complete, and parents would pay premium prices because they knew their children were getting something unique. Something made with care and attention that you couldn't find in any store. That morning, while I worked on Emma's horse, the radio was playing in the background. Some pop station that I kept on for company while I worked. Between songs, the DJ mentioned something about a volcanic eruption at Yellowstone, but it was just a brief news update sandwiched between advertisements for car dealerships and summer sales. I barely registered it. Yellowstone was hundreds of miles away, and volcanic eruptions happened all the time around the world without affecting daily life in Portland. I remember thinking about Emma as I shaped the horse's ears, trying to get them just right so they looked alert but friendly. She was one of those kids who talked to adults like they were her equals, asking serious questions about my work and listening carefully to the answers. A few weeks earlier, she had stopped by the workshop with her mom and asked me, why I made toys instead of furniture or something more practical. I told her that furniture was for grown-ups who had forgotten how to play, but toys were for people who still remembered that life should have magic in it. She had nodded solemnly, like that made perfect sense to her. The wood shavings were piling up around my feet as I worked, and I was already thinking about sweeping them up to use as kindling for winter fires. I always saved the shavings because they made excellent fire starters, and my grandfather had taught me never to waste any part of the wood. Even the smallest scraps could be useful for repairs or small detail work. Waste not, want not, he would say, which was easy advice to follow when you worked with expensive hardwoods that cost more per board foot than most people spent on groceries. Around mid-morning, Mrs. Peterson from 2 doors down stopped by to check on a dollhouse I was making for her granddaughter. Mrs. Peterson was probably 70, a retired teacher who had moved in with her son's family to help with childcare. She was one of my best customers because she understood quality craftsmanship and didn't mind paying for it. The dollhouse was a Victorian-style mansion with 3 floors, working windows, and a wraparound porch that had taken me 6 weeks to complete. As we talked about the finishing details she wanted, Mrs. Peterson mentioned that her grandson Tyler had been asking for a toy truck, something he could push around in the sandbox. I made a mental note to start sketching some designs. Tyler was maybe 7, the same age as Emma, and he had the kind of boundless energy that could only be satisfied by toys tough enough to handle serious play. I was thinking about making him something with big wheels and a dump bed that actually worked, sturdy enough to survive being buried in sand and rain. Mrs. Peterson left around 11, and I went back to work on the horse. The radio was still playing, and another news update mentioned something about volcanic activity in Iceland too, but again, it was just background noise. I was focused on getting the proportions right, making sure the horse looked powerful but not intimidating. Emma had been very specific about wanting a friendly horse, one that looked like it would be gentle with children. By lunchtime, I was making good progress. The basic shape was complete, and I was starting on the detail work that would bring the horse to life. The eyes were always the trickiest part, getting them positioned so the horse looked alert and intelligent rather than blank or scary. I had learned to carve the eyes slightly larger than realistic proportions, because children responded better to toys with expressive faces. I took a break to eat a sandwich and check my email. I had 3 new commissions that had come in overnight, including a request for a complete wooden train set from a family in Seattle. Summer was always busy season for me because parents were thinking about Christmas presents and wanted to get their orders in early for custom work. I was already booked through October, which was a good problem to have but meant I would be working long hours for the next few months. After lunch, I noticed something odd. The light coming through my workshop windows seemed different, not as bright and clear as it had been in the morning. I glanced outside and saw that the sky had developed a hazy quality, like there was a thin layer of clouds, even though the weather forecast had called for clear skies all week. I shrugged it off, figuring it was just some high-altitude haze that would burn off by afternoon. But the haze didn't burn off. If anything, it seemed to be getting thicker as the day went on. By 3 o'clock, the sunlight filtering into my workshop had taken on an orange tint that reminded me of sunset, except it was the middle of the afternoon. I stepped outside to get a better look and saw that the entire sky had this strange, dusty appearance. Mrs. Chen was standing in her yard too, looking up with a worried expression. She called over to me, asking if I had heard anything about fires in the area that might be causing smoke. I told her I hadn't, but suggested we check the news online. She nodded and went back inside, but I could see her through her kitchen window, probably looking at her computer or turning on the television to see if there were any alerts. I went back to work, but I found myself glancing out the windows more frequently. The light continued to change throughout the afternoon, becoming more and more orange and dim. It was subtle enough that I might not have noticed if I hadn't been working on detailed carving that required good lighting. I had to turn on my workshop lamps earlier than usual, something I never had to do during summer afternoons. Emma stopped by around 4 o'clock with her little brother, both of them riding their bikes slowly down the sidewalk. She wanted to see how the horse was coming along, and I showed her the progress I had made. Her eyes lit up when she saw the shape taking form, and she asked if she could touch it. I let her run her small fingers along the smooth wood, and she declared that it was going to be the most beautiful horse in the world. Her little brother, maybe 4 years old, was more interested in the wood shavings scattered around my workbench. He asked if he could have some to take home, and I scooped up a handful for him to carry in his pockets. Kids always seemed fascinated by the texture and smell of fresh wood shavings, and I was happy to share them. Emma reminded me that her birthday was in 2 weeks and made me promise the horse would be ready. I assured her it would be finished in plenty of time. After they left, I continued working until the natural light was too dim to see properly, even with the strange orange tint. That was unusual for a July evening in Portland, where daylight typically lasted until well past 8 o'clock during summer. I checked my phone and saw that it was only 6:30, but the light outside looked more like 7:30 or 8. Something was definitely off, but I couldn't put my finger on what exactly was wrong. I decided to call it a day earlier than usual and went inside to make dinner. While I cooked, I turned on the local news to see if there was any explanation for the weird lighting conditions. The meteorologist mentioned that there had been reports of atmospheric haze across the Pacific Northwest, possibly related to the volcanic eruptions that had occurred recently in Yellowstone and Iceland. She said it was nothing to be concerned about, just some high-altitude particles that might create unusual sunsets for a few days. The next morning, July 16th, I woke up to find that the haze had gotten thicker overnight. The sun was visible as a dim orange disk through what looked like a layer of dirty gauze stretched across the entire sky. The temperature felt cooler too, maybe 5 or 10 degrees below normal for a summer morning in Portland. I had to put on a light jacket when I went out to get the newspaper, something I hadn't done in July for as long as I could remember. The newspaper had a small article about the volcanic eruptions on the front page, but it was buried below stories about local politics and sports scores. The article mentioned that scientists were monitoring the situation and that there might be some temporary climate effects, but nothing that suggested any real cause for concern. The language was very technical and reassuring, full of phrases like significant but manageable and well within normal parameters. I spent the morning working on Emma's horse, but I had to keep my workshop lights on even though it was supposedly broad daylight outside. The wood glue I was using seemed to be taking longer to set than usual, which was odd because glue typically worked faster in warm weather. I made a mental note to check the expiration date on the bottle, thinking maybe I had gotten a bad batch. Mrs. Chen came over around 10 to ask if I had noticed anything strange about her tomato plants. She said they seemed to be wilting even though she had been watering them regularly, and the soil was still moist. I walked over to take a look and saw that several of her plants did indeed look stressed, with leaves that were starting to curl and yellow at the edges. She wondered if it might be some kind of plant disease, but I suggested it could be related to the unusual weather conditions. As we talked, Mrs. Chen's granddaughter came outside wearing a sweater. In July, the little girl complained that it felt like winter and her grandmother laughed and told her not to be dramatic. But I noticed that Mrs. Chen was wearing a cardigan too, something I had never seen her do during summer months. The temperature was definitely cooler than normal, though not dramatically so, just enough to be noticeable if you were paying attention. That afternoon, I had a visit from the Hendricks family, who were picking up a set of building blocks I had made for their 3-year-old son. Mr. Hendricks mentioned that his office building's air conditioning had been acting up, running constantly even though the outside temperature was lower than usual. He joked that maybe they would save some money on cooling costs if this weather pattern continued. Mrs. Hendricks was more observant. She asked me if I had noticed that some of the neighborhood kids were asking for different kinds of toys lately. Her son's friends had been requesting more indoor activities, puzzles and games they could play inside rather than outdoor toys. She thought it was just a coincidence, but I realized she was right. Several recent customers had mentioned their children wanting cozy things, stuffed animals and dolls they could cuddle with, even though it was supposed to be prime time for bicycles and playground equipment. Children often sense changes before adults did, I had learned over the years. They were more sensitive to shifts in mood and environment, more likely to react to things that grown-ups dismissed as minor variations. If kids were gravitating toward comfort items and indoor activities during what should have been peak summer, maybe they were picking up on something the rest of us were missing. That evening, the local news devoted more time to the atmospheric conditions. The meteorologist explained that particles from the volcanic eruptions were creating a kind of natural sunscreen effect, blocking some of the sun's radiation and causing the unusual lighting. She emphasized that this was a temporary phenomenon that would clear up within a few weeks as the particles settled out of the atmosphere. The tone was still reassuring, but I noticed that she spent more time on the topic than she had the day before. July 17th brought more of the same, except everything seemed slightly more pronounced. The sky was hazier, the temperature was a few degrees cooler, and the light had an even stronger orange tint that made colors look muted and strange. I found myself squinting when I worked, even with my shop lights on, because the quality of the light was so different from what I was used to. I was carving details on the horse's face when Emma's mother, Maria Rodriguez, stopped by to check on the progress. She seemed more anxious than usual, asking several times if I was sure the horse would be ready for Emma's birthday. I assured her it would be finished with time to spare, but she kept looking around my workshop like she was trying to memorize it. When I asked if everything was okay, she said she was just worried about some things she had been hearing on the news. Maria worked as a nurse at Portland General Hospital, and she mentioned that they had been seeing more patients with respiratory complaints over the past few days. Nothing serious, mostly people with mild coughing or throat irritation, but the numbers were higher than normal for summer when air quality was usually at its best. Her supervisor had suggested it might be related to the atmospheric particles from the volcanic eruptions, but they were monitoring the situation closely. She also said that some of her coworkers were talking about stocking up on extra groceries, just in case the weather conditions affected transportation or supply chains. It seemed like an overreaction to me, but Maria was a practical person who didn't panic easily. If she was concerned enough to mention it, maybe there was more to this situation than the reassuring news reports were letting on. After she left, I found myself thinking about my own preparations. I had always kept a well-stocked pantry and emergency supplies because my grandfather had lived through World War II and had taught me the value of being prepared for unexpected situations. But most of my emergency planning was focused on earthquakes or severe winter storms, the kinds of disasters that were common in the Pacific Northwest. I had never considered what I might need if summer weather disappeared entirely. That night, I decided to do some research online about volcanic winters. What I found was more disturbing than the cheerful news reports had suggested. Historical eruptions had sometimes caused global climate changes that lasted for years, not weeks. Crops failed, temperatures dropped dramatically, and entire civilizations had been disrupted by extended periods of reduced sunlight. The 1815 eruption of Mount Tambora had caused what historians called the year without a summer, when snow fell in New England during June and harvests failed across Europe. But those were single eruptions, and what we were experiencing was the combined effect of two major eruptions happening within weeks of each other. I couldn't find any historical precedent for that kind of double impact. The scientific articles I could understand suggested that the effects might be more severe and longer lasting than anyone was publicly admitting. I stayed up late that night, reading everything I could find about volcanic impacts on climate. The more I learned, the more worried I became. If the scientists were right about the potential for extended cooling, if this wasn't just a temporary inconvenience that would clear up in a few weeks, then everything was about to change in ways that no one seemed prepared for. July 18th dawned colder than any July day I could remember in Portland. I had to wear a winter jacket to go outside and get the newspaper, and my breath was visible in the air. In July, the temperature gauge on my back porch read 52 degrees, at least 20 degrees below normal for a summer morning. Mrs. Chen's tomato plants looked worse, with several of them clearly dying despite her best efforts to save them. The newspaper finally had the volcanic situation on the front page, but the tone was still reassuring. Officials were quoted saying that while the cooling was more pronounced than initially expected, it was still within the range of natural variation and would normalize soon. They advised people to dress warmly and be patient while atmospheric conditions returned to normal. But I was starting to suspect that normal might be a long time coming if it came back at all. As I worked on Emma's rocking horse that morning, carving the final details that would bring it to life, I found myself wondering if she would ever get to ride it in the warm summer sunshine I had imagined when I started the project. The horse was nearly finished, more beautiful than I had originally planned, but the world it was being born into was becoming stranger and more uncertain every day. I had no idea that within 2 weeks, Emma would be dead, and I would be carrying my grandfather's tools through the frozen streets of Portland, looking for a way to keep children alive in a world where summer had died forever. The temperature kept dropping. July 19th, 20 degrees below normal. July 20th, 25 degrees below normal. By July 21st, I was wearing winter clothes to work in my garage, and the wood glue wasn't setting properly no matter how long I waited. The cold was affecting everything, even the basic chemistry of my craft. Emma's rocking horse was nearly complete, just needing final sanding and the protective finish that would make it safe for a child to use. But every time I applied the Danish oil, it seemed to absorb into the wood differently than usual, taking twice as long to cure in the unnatural cold. I had to bring a space heater into the workshop just to maintain enough warmth for the finish to set correctly. Mrs. Chen's tomato plants were completely dead by then. Not just wilted or stressed, but blackened and frozen as if winter had come in the middle of summer. She stood in her yard every morning, staring at the destroyed garden she had worked on for months, her granddaughter clinging to her side asking why all the plants had gotten sick. I wanted to tell the little girl that the plants weren't sick, they were dead, but you don't say things like that to 5-year-olds. The news reports were still maintaining their optimistic tone, but I noticed they were spending more time on the story now. The meteorologists were running out of ways to say temporary and expected without sounding repetitive. More scientists were being interviewed, and while their language remained carefully neutral, I could see concern in their faces when they thought the cameras weren't focused on them. On July 22nd, I made a decision that probably saved my life, though I didn't realize it at the time. I decided to start packing my essential tools and materials into portable containers, just in case I needed to leave my workshop quickly. My grandfather's hand tools went into the leather satchel he had given me when I started my apprenticeship. My best carving knives and chisels got wrapped in protective cloth. I selected a variety of wood scraps and small pieces that could be useful for emergency repairs or quick projects. At the time, I told myself I was just being cautious. Maybe the cooling would get worse before it got better, and I might need to work somewhere with better heating. But deep down, I think I was starting to understand that my comfortable life in the workshop was coming to an end. The world was changing too fast and too dramatically for business as usual. That afternoon, Tyler Peterson came running over to my workshop, crying because his sandbox sand had frozen solid. Frozen sand. In July, his grandmother followed behind him, looking older than I had ever seen her, trying to explain to a 7-year-old why summer had stopped working. Tyler asked me if I could make him a toy that would help him dig through frozen sand, something stronger than his plastic trucks that were cracking in the cold. I promised Tyler I would work on something for him, but privately I was wondering if there would be time to finish it. The rate of change was accelerating. Every day brought temperature drops that should have taken weeks or months. Whatever was happening in the atmosphere, it was happening faster than any of the experts had predicted. July 23rd brought the first real panic. The grocery stores started running out of heating fuel and warm clothing. People who had been dismissing the cold as a temporary inconvenience suddenly realized they might need to heat their homes in July, and they weren't prepared for it. Lines formed at hardware stores as people bought space heaters, generators, and emergency supplies that most of them had never thought they would need during summer. I joined those lines myself, buying extra batteries, candles, and a camping stove that could work without electricity. The cashier was a teenager who looked scared and confused, probably working her first summer job and dealing with customers who were increasingly anxious and demanding. She asked me if I thought things would get back to normal soon. I told her I hoped so, but I didn't believe it myself anymore. That evening, Maria Rodriguez called to ask if Emma's rocking horse was finished. Her voice sounded strained, and she explained that Emma had been having nightmares about the cold and couldn't understand why summer had disappeared. Maria thought maybe having the horse would help Emma feel more secure, give her something beautiful and normal to focus on while the world felt increasingly strange. I told Maria the horse would be ready the next day, and I worked late into the night to complete the final finishing touches. By candlelight and the glow of my space heater, I applied the last coat of protective finish and carved Emma's name into the base of the rocker. It was some of my finest work, every detail perfect, every surface smooth enough that a child could run her hands over it without finding a single rough spot. As I worked, I found myself wondering if this would be the last toy I ever made for a child's birthday party. The thought seemed dramatic and pessimistic, but I couldn't shake the feeling that celebrations and normal childhood milestones were about to become luxuries that few families could afford. July 24th was the day everything changed from strange to terrifying. I woke up to find ice on my windows. Actual ice, thick enough that I had to scrape it off like I would in January. The temperature outside was 38 degrees, just above freezing and falling. Mrs. Chen was standing in her yard wearing a winter coat, her breath visible in white puffs as she tried to understand what had happened to her world overnight. The radio news that morning was different. Gone was the reassuring tone and the suggestions that conditions would improve soon. Instead, the announcers were talking about emergency shelters being set up in schools and community centers for people whose homes couldn't be adequately heated. They were advising residents to check on elderly neighbors and to conserve heating fuel because supply trucks were having difficulty operating in the unexpected conditions. I delivered Emma's rocking horse that morning, carrying it through streets that looked more like late autumn than summer. Maria answered the door wearing a heavy sweater and invited me in for coffee, but I could see she was struggling to keep her house warm. Emma was bundled up in blankets on the couch, but her face lit up when she saw the horse. She climbed onto it immediately, rocking back and forth while making soft whinnying sounds. For a few minutes, she seemed like a normal 7-year-old playing with a new toy. But then she asked me why it was so cold, and why her mom had to put extra blankets on her bed, and when summer was coming back. Maria and I exchanged looks over her head, both of us realizing that we had no good answers to give her. I left the Rodriguez house feeling deeply unsettled. Emma's questions had been so innocent and logical, the kinds of questions adults were asking too, but without the honest confusion of childhood. When would summer come back? Why was it so cold? What had happened to the normal world? By July 26th, the temperature had dropped to 32 degrees during the day and below freezing at night. Portland, Oregon was experiencing winter weather in July, and the city infrastructure wasn't equipped to handle it. Power lines were failing under ice loads they were never designed to carry. Water pipes were freezing in homes that had no insulation for cold weather. Roads were becoming dangerous as ice formed overnight and never melted during the day. The radio announced that the city was opening emergency warming centers in large buildings that could be heated more efficiently than individual homes. The Moda Center, where the Trail Blazers played basketball, was being converted to house several thousand people who couldn't keep their homes warm enough to survive the unprecedented cold. I spent that day making a decision I never thought I would have to make. Stay in my workshop and try to ride out the crisis alone, or admit that this was beyond what any individual could handle and join the mass of people seeking shelter in the arena. My house was old and poorly insulated, built for Portland's mild climate, not for freezing temperatures that seemed to be getting worse every day. My space heaters were struggling to keep even my small workshop above freezing. That evening, as I sat in my cold house wearing every piece of warm clothing I owned, I heard Mrs. Peterson screaming next door. By the time I got outside, she was kneeling in her backyard where Tyler had collapsed while playing with his toy trucks. The 7-year-old boy was unconscious, his lips blue, his small body shivering uncontrollably. Hypothermia had struck him down in his own backyard in July while his grandmother watched from the kitchen window. The paramedics who responded were exhausted and overworked, dealing with dozens of similar calls throughout the city. They told Mrs. Peterson that Tyler would survive, but barely, and only because she had found him quickly. They wrapped him in warming blankets and took him to the hospital, leaving behind a grandmother who looked like she had aged 10 years in 10 minutes. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Tyler collapsing in his backyard, about Emma asking when summer would come back, about Mrs. Chen's dead tomato plants and frozen sand in playground sandboxes. Everything that had made sense about life in Portland, everything that had seemed permanent and reliable, was disappearing under an impossible winter that had arrived without warning. July 27th was the day I packed my truck and left my workshop forever. The temperature that morning was 28 degrees, cold enough that my water pipes had frozen overnight. I loaded my grandfather's tools, my essential materials, some food, and all the warm clothing I could find. The finished toys on my workshop shelves I left behind, except for one small carved bear that I tucked into my jacket pocket. Something told me it might be important later. The drive to the Moda Center took an hour instead of the usual 20 minutes because the roads were treacherous with ice and filled with other people making the same journey I was. Families loaded down with suitcases and sleeping bags, elderly people being helped by their adult children, teenagers carrying pets in carriers because the shelters might not allow animals. The whole city seemed to be in motion, everyone heading toward the few places that promised warmth and safety. The Moda Center parking lot was chaos. Hundreds of cars and trucks filled every space, with more vehicles arriving constantly. Volunteers were trying to direct traffic and help people unload their belongings, but they were overwhelmed by the sheer number of people seeking shelter. I parked as close as I could get and shouldered my bag of tools, carrying my most precious possessions toward an uncertain future. The arena itself was even more overwhelming. 2,000 people had already claimed spots inside the massive space, spreading sleeping bags and blankets in family clusters across the basketball court and up into the lower seating areas. The noise was constant, a mixture of crying children, worried conversations, and the general sounds of too many people trying to exist in a space never designed for living. I found a spot near what had been the concession stands, far enough from the main crowds to have some space to work, but close enough to the facilities to be practical. I spread out my sleeping bag and set up my tools in a small area that would become my workshop for the foreseeable future. The concrete floor was hard and cold, but the arena was heated, and that was more than I could say for my house. The first person I met was Sarah Martinez, a single mother with 3 children who had claimed the space next to mine. Her kids were ages 5, 8, and 12, and they were handling the situation better than many of the adults around them. The youngest, a girl named Lucy, was fascinated by my tools and asked what I made with them. When I told her I was a toymaker, she asked if I could make something for her baby doll, which had lost its dress during the evacuation. That simple request became my first project in the shelter. Using scraps of fabric donated by other families and some careful needlework, I created a new dress for Lucy's doll. It wasn't technically woodworking, but it was crafting something to comfort a child, which felt like the most important skill I could offer in that place. Lucy's smile when I gave her the finished dress was the first purely happy expression I had seen in days. Word spread quickly that there was a toymaker in the shelter. Parents started approaching me with requests, not for elaborate custom pieces like I had made in my workshop, but for simple, practical items that might help their children cope with the fear and displacement they were experiencing. A wooden spoon for a toddler to teeth on, a simple puzzle to keep restless hands busy, small carved animals that could fit in a pocket and provide comfort during scary moments. I started working with whatever materials I could find or trade for. Broken furniture became raw wood for carving. Cardboard from supply boxes could be cut into puzzle pieces. Other residents contributed fabric scraps, buttons, and small hardware that could be incorporated into toys. The work was different from my custom commissions, but it felt more urgent and necessary than anything I had ever made. Dr. Elena Martinez, who was not related to Sarah despite sharing a last name, was a pediatrician who had been caught at the hospital when the crisis began and had come to the shelter to volunteer her medical services. She noticed what I was doing and made a point of talking to me about the psychological benefits of play for children under stress. She explained that kids who had toys to focus on were showing better emotional regulation and were easier for their parents to manage in the difficult conditions. Dr. Martinez became an advocate for my work when other adults questioned whether toy making was an appropriate use of resources during an emergency. She had data and medical training to back up what I knew instinctively, that children needed more than just food and shelter to survive a crisis like this. They needed comfort, distraction, and reasons to believe that adults still cared about their happiness and well-being. The shelter was organized by volunteers and city officials who were making things up as they went along. No, one had planned for housing thousands of people in a basketball arena during a climate emergency that wasn't supposed to exist. Food was distributed twice a day from a central location. Bathroom facilities were limited and always crowded. Privacy was essentially non-existent, and tensions were rising as people realized this might not be a temporary situation. I had been in the shelter for 3 days when I met old Pete, a retired mechanic in his 70s, who had ended up there after his apartment's heating system failed completely. Pete had worked with his hands his entire life, and he was fascinated by my carving techniques. We started collaborating on projects that combined his mechanical knowledge with my woodworking skills, creating toys that moved and worked in ways that delighted the children around us. Pete also had a more practical perspective on our situation than most of the other residents. He had lived through economic downturns, natural disasters, and family crises that had taught him to focus on what was immediately necessary rather than worrying about long-term planning. He pointed out that we were lucky to have shelter and heat, that things could be much worse, and that our job was to make the best of whatever situation we found ourselves in. But even Pete was concerned about the reports we were hearing from outside the shelter. The temperature had continued dropping, reaching the low 20s during the day and single digits at night. Other emergency shelters around the city were filling up as more people abandoned homes that couldn't be kept warm. Supply trucks were having increasing difficulty navigating icy roads, and there were rumors that food distribution might become irregular if conditions didn't improve soon. On my 5th day in the shelter, August 1st, we got news that made everyone realize how serious our situation had become. Emma Rodriguez was dead. Maria had tried to keep their house warm using a camping stove, but carbon monoxide poisoning had taken her daughter during the night. The little girl who had asked me when summer would come back would never see it return, and the rocking horse I had finished with such care would never carry her through imaginary adventures. I sat in my small space that night, holding the carved bear I had brought from my workshop, thinking about Emma climbing onto her rocking horse just a week earlier. She had been so excited, so full of life and curiosity, trusting that the adults around her would keep her safe and that the world would return to making sense. We had failed her, all of us, by not understanding quickly enough how much danger we were all in. The news about Emma spread through the shelter like a cold wind, making parents hold their children tighter and volunteers work with renewed urgency to maintain the heating systems that were keeping us all alive. Everyone understood that we were not just camping out temporarily until normal life resumed. We were refugees in our own city, dependent on community resources and cooperative effort to survive conditions that were beyond anything any of us had experienced. That night, as I worked on a small wooden horse for Lucy Martinez, carving by the light of battery-powered lanterns, I realized that my old life was truly over. Vincent Delacroix, the independent craftsman who took custom orders and worked at his own pace, no longer existed. In his place was someone who would have to learn to make essential items from salvaged materials, to work cooperatively with other survivors, and to measure success not by the beauty of finished pieces, but by their ability to help children and families cope with an impossible situation. But I was still alive, still able to use my hands and my skills to make things that mattered. As long as there were children who needed comfort and parents who were fighting to maintain hope, there would be work for me to do. The world had ended, but people were still people, and children still needed reasons to believe that tomorrow might be better than today. The supply officer's announcement came the next morning, delivered over a borrowed megaphone to the 2,000 residents gathered in the arena. We had enough food stored to last 2 more weeks at current rationing levels. After that, we would be dependent on supply deliveries that were becoming increasingly unreliable as road conditions deteriorated throughout the region. Everyone needed to prepare for the possibility that we might be on our own for an extended period, possibly months, 2 weeks. I looked around at the families surrounding me, at the children who had started to treat this strange new life as normal, at the elderly people who were struggling more each day with the cold and stress. 2 weeks to prove that what I did with wood and tools and imagination wasn't just a luxury for better times, but something essential for keeping people human when everything else was falling apart. 2 weeks to prove my worth. That was the challenge hanging over everything I did from August 2nd forward. The shelter leadership had called a meeting of all the residents, packed into the arena seating like we were watching a basketball game instead of planning for survival. The committee was made up of city officials, volunteers, and a few residents who had emerged as natural organizers during our first week together. The woman speaking was Janet Morrison, a city councilwoman who had been at City Hall when the crisis began and had volunteered to coordinate shelter operations. She stood at center court with a clipboard and a tired expression, explaining that we needed to prioritize essential activities and eliminate anything that wasn't directly contributing to our survival. Food preparation, sanitation, security, medical care, child supervision. Everything else was going to be evaluated for its practical value. I felt hundreds of pairs of eyes turning toward my corner where I had been carving a set of wooden blocks for the Thompson twins. Some people were nodding in agreement with the new efficiency measures. Others were looking at me with expressions that ranged from apologetic to accusatory. The message was clear enough without anyone saying it directly. Prove that toys matter when people are starving, or stop using resources that could save lives. Dr. Martinez stood up from her seat in the lower section and asked to address the group. She had been documenting the psychological effects of the shelter environment on children and families, and she had numbers to back up what I had been seeing firsthand. Kids who had access to toys and structured play activities were sleeping better, eating more consistently, and showing fewer behavioral problems than those who didn't. Parents who could give their children something to focus on besides fear and uncertainty were handling their own stress better too. But numbers and psychology research weren't enough for everyone. A man named Robert Chen, no relation to my former neighbor, stood up and pointed out that wood scraps could be used for fuel, that fabric could be used for insulation, and that the time I spent carving could be spent helping with essential tasks like food distribution or facility maintenance. He wasn't wrong about the practical value of those materials, but he was missing something crucial about what happens to people when survival becomes the only thing that matters. Sarah Martinez, the single mother whose space was next to mine, surprised everyone by speaking up in my defense. She told the group about how her 8-year-old son Michael had stopped having nightmares after I made him a small wooden soldier to keep beside his sleeping bag. How her 5-year-old daughter Lucy had started helping other children instead of crying constantly, ever since she had gotten the new dress for her doll. How having something beautiful and carefully made helped her remember that they were still a family, not just refugees competing for resources. The debate went on for an hour, with people sharing stories and opinions about what we could afford to prioritize when everything felt like a matter of life and death. But finally, Janet Morrison made a decision that would determine whether I stayed in the shelter or was asked to leave. I would have 1 week to demonstrate that toy making contributed to the overall welfare of the community. If I could show measurable benefits, I could continue with access to shared materials. If not, I would need to find other ways to contribute or find somewhere else to go. 1 week. 7 days to prove that wonder and beauty and comfort weren't luxuries that people had to give up when the world turned dangerous. I went back to my corner that night knowing that everything I had learned about my craft, everything my grandfather had taught me about the importance of making things that brought joy to children, was about to be tested in ways I had never imagined. I started by making a list of every child in the shelter and what kind of toy or comfort item might help them specifically. Lucy Martinez needed something she could share with other kids to reinforce her helpful behavior. The Thompson twins, who were constantly fighting over everything, needed individual items that were clearly theirs but could be used together. Marcus Williams, a 6-year-old whose parents were having loud arguments every night, needed something that could distract him when family tensions got overwhelming. But I also started thinking about toys differently than I ever had before. Instead of focusing purely on entertainment or beauty, I began designing items that taught practical skills while still providing the comfort and engagement that children needed. A puzzle that also demonstrated how knots worked. A set of blocks that could be used for building, but also for sorting and counting exercises that would keep young minds active. A wooden whistle that could be a toy, but could also be used to signal for help if someone got lost in the crowds. Old Pete became my most important collaborator during that week. His mechanical knowledge combined with my woodworking skills let us create toys that moved and worked in ways that fascinated children, while teaching them basic principles of engineering and problem solving. We made a wooden truck with wheels that actually turned and axles that demonstrated leverage. A simple crane that could lift small objects and showed kids how pulleys worked. A spinning top that was perfectly balanced and could run for minutes, hypnotizing children who were too anxious to focus on anything else. Dr. Martinez helped me track the effects of what we were doing. She carried a notebook everywhere, recording observations about which children seemed calmer, which families were cooperating better, and which interventions were having the most positive impact. She also talked to parents about what they were seeing at home, whether their kids were sleeping better or eating more regularly or showing less aggressive behavior toward siblings. The results were more dramatic than even I had expected. Children who had been having constant tantrums were suddenly manageable when they had something engaging to occupy their hands and minds. Parents who had been snapping at each other over minor frustrations were finding patience they didn't know they still had when their kids were content and occupied. The noise level in our section of the arena decreased noticeably as children played quietly with wooden toys instead of running around with nothing constructive to do. But the real test came on August 5th, when food distribution was delayed because one of the supply trucks had broken down on the icy roads outside the city. The announcement that dinner would be 3 hours late sent waves of anxiety through the shelter population. Adults were hungry and worried about what the delay might mean for future deliveries. Children were cranky and demanding, sensing their parents' stress and reacting with tears and tantrums. In our section, where most of the kids had wooden toys to play with, the reaction was much calmer. Lucy Martinez organized a game where several children used their carved animals to act out stories. The Thompson twins worked together to build an elaborate tower with their blocks. Marcus Williams sat quietly spinning his top, watching the hypnotic motion while his parents argued in whispers behind him. The difference was visible and audible to anyone who walked through the different areas of the shelter. Janet Morrison came by during the delay to see how my section was handling the stress. She found children playing cooperatively while their parents talked quietly instead of shouting. She watched Lucy teach younger kids how to use the wooden puzzle I had made, turning toy time into a learning experience that kept 6 children occupied for an hour. She saw Marcus demonstrate his spinning top to other kids, proudly explaining how it worked and teaching them to make it spin correctly. When food finally arrived and distribution began, the children in my section lined up quietly and waited their turns without the pushing and crying that was happening in other areas. Parents were able to focus on getting their families fed efficiently instead of managing behavioral problems while trying to navigate the crowded serving area. The whole process went more smoothly because everyone was calmer and more cooperative. That evening, Janet Morrison announced that my work had proven its value to the community. Not only would I be allowed to continue making toys, but the shelter would start providing me with a small allocation of materials specifically for that purpose. Other residents would be encouraged to save appropriate scraps and donate them to toy-making efforts. Dr. Martinez would continue tracking the psychological benefits, and we would look for ways to expand the program if resources allowed. But even as I celebrated this victory, I was hearing troubling reports from the outside world that made me realize our challenges were just beginning. The temperature had dropped to single digits above zero during the day, with nights well below zero. Other shelters in the city were reporting serious overcrowding, as more people abandoned homes that couldn't be heated. Some smaller emergency centers had closed entirely when their heating systems failed or their food supplies ran out. Even more concerning were the reports from outside Portland. The volcanic cooling effect was global, with similar temperature drops being reported across North America and Europe. Agricultural regions were experiencing crop failures on a massive scale. Transportation networks were breaking down as vehicles and infrastructure systems encountered weather conditions they were never designed to handle. The emergency was spreading far beyond what anyone had initially predicted. Radio communications with other cities were becoming sporadic as power grids failed and communication towers experienced problems with ice accumulation and extreme cold. We were getting fragments of information about similar mass relocations in Seattle, San Francisco, and other West Coast cities, but details were scarce and often contradictory. It was becoming clear that Portland wasn't dealing with an isolated crisis, but was part of a much larger collapse of normal life across vast regions. Within the shelter, I started noticing changes that suggested we were adapting to a new reality rather than waiting for a return to normal conditions. People were creating more permanent living arrangements, using donated furniture and salvaged materials to divide the open arena space into family areas with some privacy. Residents with specialized skills were being formally recognized and given leadership roles in their areas of expertise. A barter economy was developing as people traded services and resources without involving money. I became part of this new economic system, trading toys and carved items for materials, food, and services I needed. A wooden puzzle for the Williams family got me extra fabric scraps for future projects. A set of carved animals for the Johnson children earned me a better sleeping bag when winter clothing donations arrived. My skills had value in this world, but it was a different kind of value than I had known in my workshop days. The children were adapting too, in ways that were both impressive and heartbreaking. Kids who had never shared toys before were learning to take turns and cooperate out of necessity. Children who had been shy and withdrawn were finding confidence by teaching younger kids how to use the toys I made. But they were also losing some of the innocence and security that childhood was supposed to provide, becoming too aware of adult worries and too accepting of conditions that should have been temporary emergencies. Lucy Martinez, who was now 6, started asking me questions about how to carve wood herself. She wanted to learn to make things instead of just playing with them, understanding somehow that skills were going to be more important than possessions in whatever world we were creating. I began teaching her basic techniques with small, safe tools, and she picked up the concepts quickly. Her concentration and patience were remarkable for a child her age, but they were also signs of how much responsibility she felt to contribute to her family's survival. By August 10th, I had established a regular routine that balanced toy making with other essential contributions to shelter life. Mornings were for working on individual requests and custom pieces for children who needed specific types of comfort or stimulation. Afternoons were for teaching basic woodworking skills to older kids and interested adults, sharing knowledge that might be useful for repairs and practical crafting. Evenings were for collaborative projects with old Pete and others, creating items that served multiple purposes and helped solve shelter problems. But I was also starting to stockpile certain materials quietly, keeping a private reserve of wood scraps, fabric pieces, and small hardware that I sensed might become much more valuable later. Call it hoarding if you want. But I had learned from my grandfather that craftsmen needed to think ahead about material supplies, and I was seeing signs that our current access to donated resources might not last indefinitely. Other people were doing the same thing, I noticed. Families were keeping extra food beyond their daily rations when they could manage it. People with medical supplies were being very careful about how much they shared with the general medical station. Everyone was starting to understand that this was not a temporary emergency that would end with a return to normal life, but a permanent change that required different strategies for survival. The breaking point came on August 12th, when we received news that fundamentally changed how everyone thought about our situation. A supply convoy that had been expected for 3 days had finally made radio contact, but they were stuck 50 miles outside Portland and would not be able to reach us. The roads were impassable due to ice and abandoned vehicles, and the drivers reported that other supply depots along their route had been overwhelmed by refugee populations and had no materials left to share. We were on our own, not for a few more days or weeks, but potentially for months. The food we had stored would last maybe 10 more days with strict rationing. Heating fuel was already being conserved so carefully that the arena temperature was barely above freezing during the day and well below freezing at night. Medical supplies were running low, and there was no prospect of getting more anytime soon. Janet Morrison called another all-resident meeting that evening, and the mood was completely different from the discussion about toy-making priorities. People were scared in a way they hadn't been before, realizing that the safety net they had been counting on might not exist. There was talk about sending groups of volunteers to attempt overland travel to other shelters or supply centers. There was discussion about rationing food even more severely and reducing heating to extend our supplies. There were arguments about whether to accept new refugees who were still arriving daily or to close the shelter to preserve resources for current residents. But there was also something else happening in that meeting, something that gave me hope even as the situation became more desperate. People were talking about skills and resources in ways that recognized everyone's potential contributions. Sarah Martinez mentioned that she had been a bookkeeper before the crisis and could help organize more efficient resource distribution. Old Pete volunteered to train other people in mechanical repair techniques so that we could maintain our heating and electrical systems without relying on outside technicians. Dr. Martinez proposed expanding her psychological support services to help more families cope with the stress of long-term displacement. And several parents spoke up about how important it had become to maintain normal developmental activities for their children, even under extraordinary circumstances. They talked about kids learning to read and write with makeshift materials, about maintaining bedtime routines that helped families feel stable, and about the value of play and creativity in keeping children emotionally healthy. They were advocating for continued support of educational and comfort activities, not as luxuries, but as essential elements of community survival. I realized that night that I had passed the test, but it wasn't the test I thought I was taking. The question hadn't been whether toys were valuable enough to justify using resources during an emergency. The question had been whether I could adapt my skills to contribute to a community that was going to need every possible advantage to survive what was coming next. And the answer was yes, but only if I kept evolving my understanding of what my work needed to accomplish. Over the next few days, I started designing and building things that pushed the boundaries between toys and tools, between comfort items and practical equipment. A wooden game that taught children how to tie knots that could be used for shelter construction or equipment repair. A set of carved blocks that could be used for play, but also for teaching basic mathematics and measurement skills. A whistle that could entertain kids, but could also be used for emergency signaling if sections of the shelter needed to communicate across the noisy arena. The line between essential and non-essential was blurring, as we all realized that psychological health, community cooperation, and skill development were just as important for long-term survival as food and shelter. Children who were learning and growing and maintaining their capacity for joy were going to be better equipped to handle whatever came next than kids who were just warehoused and kept alive. Adults who could still find reasons to hope and work together were going to be more effective at solving problems than people who had given up everything except basic biological survival. But I was also becoming aware of tensions within the shelter that suggested our current unity might not last indefinitely. Resources were becoming more scarce, decisions were becoming more difficult, and people were starting to divide into groups based on their ideas about priorities and survival strategies. Some residents thought we should be preparing to leave the shelter and establish smaller, more sustainable communities outside the city. Others believed we should focus on fortifying our current position and making it more self-sufficient. Still others were advocating for attempts to reach other population centers where conditions might be better. I tried to stay neutral in these debates while building relationships across different factions. My toys were popular with children from families with all different survival philosophies, and parents from all groups seemed to value what I was contributing to community life. But I could see that unity was fragile, and that difficult decisions ahead might force people to choose sides in ways that could tear apart everything we had built together. The next test was coming, and it was going to be bigger than proving the value of wooden toys to a community committee. It was going to be about whether we could hold together as a functioning society when the resources we depended on ran out entirely, and when survival stopped being about rationing existing supplies and started being about creating everything we needed from whatever we could find or make ourselves. Marcus Williams died on August 18th, not from cold or hunger, but from an infection that should have been easily treatable with antibiotics that we didn't have. He was the 6-year-old who had been fascinated by the spinning top I made for him, who had learned to balance it perfectly and had taught other kids the technique. His parents had been fighting constantly before he got the top, but they had started getting along better when he was happier and less demanding of their attention. Dr. Martinez did everything she could with the limited medical supplies available, but without proper antibiotics and hospital equipment, a simple ear infection turned into something that killed a healthy child in 3 days. Marcus died holding the wooden top I had carved for him, and his parents blamed themselves for bringing him to the shelter, instead of somehow finding a way to get him to a real hospital that might have been able to save him. The funeral was held in the arena, with Marcus's body wrapped in donated blankets because we didn't have access to traditional burial services. Janet Morrison led a memorial service that tried to balance grief with the need to keep everyone focused on survival tasks. People shared memories of Marcus and talked about how his cheerful personality had made life better for everyone around him. But underneath the ceremony was a growing awareness that he probably wouldn't be the last child we would lose to preventable causes. That night, I sat in my corner of the arena working on a new toy for another child, carving by the light of a battery-powered lantern and thinking about Marcus asking me how the spinning top worked. He had been so curious about the physics of balance and rotation, so eager to understand and share what he learned. Now he was gone, and all the toys in the world couldn't bring him back or protect the other kids from similar fates. But I kept carving anyway, because giving up wasn't an option when 42 other children were counting on the adults around them to maintain hope and normalcy and reasons to believe that tomorrow could be better than today. Marcus was gone, but Lucy Martinez was still learning woodworking techniques that might help her survive in a world where making things by hand was becoming essential again. The Thompson twins were still using their blocks to build elaborate structures that taught them engineering principles they might need someday. Other kids were still sleeping better and cooperating more when they had something comforting to hold on to during the long, cold nights. The world had ended, but children were still children, and my job was still to give them reasons to believe that being human meant more than just staying alive. Even when staying alive was becoming harder every day, and when the grown-ups around them were running out of answers about how to make any of this work for much longer. The refugees started arriving on August 20th, 3 days after we buried Marcus Williams. At first, it was just a few families trickling in from failed shelters around the city, carrying whatever they could manage in backpacks and shopping carts. Then it became a steady stream of desperate people who had heard that the Moda Center was still operating and still had heat. By August 22nd, we had gone from 2,000 residents to nearly 2,200, and people were still coming. The new arrivals brought stories that made our situation look fortunate by comparison. The shelter at Roosevelt High School had closed when their heating system failed completely, and 3 elderly residents died of exposure in a single night. The community center in southeast Portland had been abandoned after running out of food and being overwhelmed by refugees from smaller emergency sites. The convention center downtown had descended into chaos when competing groups started fighting over resources and leadership. But each new family also meant our already stretched supplies had to cover more people for less time. Janet Morrison and the shelter leadership were doing their best to screen new arrivals and turn away people who seemed like they might cause problems. But how do you tell a mother with 2 young children that there's no room for them when the temperature outside is 15 degrees below zero and falling every day? I watched families claiming whatever floor space they could find, setting up makeshift homes in corridors and storage areas that weren't designed for human habitation. Parents tried to maintain some sense of normalcy for their children while dealing with the reality that privacy, personal space, and individual choice had become luxuries that none of us could afford anymore. Kids who had never shared anything were suddenly expected to take turns with toys, books, and even sleeping areas. The new children were traumatized in ways that went beyond what the original shelter residents had experienced. Many of them had witnessed violence or death in failed shelters before reaching us. Some had been separated from family members during chaotic evacuations and didn't know if their relatives were alive or dead. Others had medical conditions that required medications we didn't have or treatments we couldn't provide with our limited resources. Dr. Martinez was overwhelmed trying to provide psychological support to so many new cases, while also maintaining care for the families who had been with us from the beginning. She started training other adults to recognize signs of severe trauma and depression in children, teaching basic intervention techniques that could help until professional counseling was available. But professional counseling meant trained therapists with proper facilities and adequate time, none of which existed in our current situation. I found myself working longer hours as desperate parents approached me with requests for toys that might help their newly arrived children cope with the transition to shelter life. A wooden puzzle for 8-year-old Jennifer Walsh, whose family had walked 15 miles through frozen streets after their previous shelter ran out of heating fuel. A carved bear for 5-year-old Tommy Chen, who hadn't spoken a word since watching his grandfather die of pneumonia 3 days earlier. A set of blocks for the Anderson twins, who had developed a habit of screaming tantrums whenever they were separated even briefly. But the materials I had been stockpiling were running low, and the donations from other residents had slowed as people realized they might need every scrap of fabric and wood for their own survival needs. I started making toys that required less material and more creativity, using techniques my grandfather had taught me for working with limited resources during wartime. Simple carved figures that could be made from tiny pieces of wood, dolls fashioned from scraps of cloth and stuffing salvaged from damaged furniture, games that use stones or bottle caps instead of custom-made pieces. The most challenging requests came from parents who wanted me to replace toys their children had lost during evacuation from previous shelters. A stuffed elephant that had been left behind when the family fled their burning apartment building. A wooden train that had been traded for food during a desperate moment at another emergency center. A doll that had been accidentally left in a car that broke down during the journey to our shelter. I couldn't recreate these specific items, but I could try to capture something of their comfort value in new pieces that might serve similar emotional functions. Old Pete and I started working together on larger projects that could benefit multiple families at once. A wooden toy chest that could store the growing collection of carved animals and handmade games. A set of low benches that could serve as seating during the day and toy storage at night. A puppet theater constructed from salvaged cardboard and fabric that could provide entertainment for groups of children, while giving parents brief periods of reduced supervision responsibility. But the puppet theater project revealed tensions that were growing within the shelter community. Some of the newer residents questioned why resources were being used for entertainment when people were hungry and cold. They pointed out that the fabric used for puppet costumes could have been used for additional blankets, and that the time spent constructing the theater could have been devoted to more essential tasks like food preparation or facility maintenance. The debate echoed the earlier discussion about toy-making priorities, but with a harder edge because resources were now scarcer, and the community was larger and less cohesive than it had been during our first weeks together. People who had lived through the initial crisis period felt they had earned certain privileges and accommodations. Newer arrivals felt they deserved equal access to resources and decision-making processes despite not having contributed to the work of establishing the shelter. Robert Chen, who had opposed my toy making from the beginning, emerged as a spokesperson for residents who thought the shelter needed to focus exclusively on survival necessities. He argued that entertainment and comfort items were luxuries we could no longer afford when people were dying from preventable causes due to lack of medical supplies and adequate nutrition. He proposed that all non-essential activities should be suspended, and that everyone should be required to contribute 8 hours daily to food procurement, facility maintenance, or security duties. The security duties he mentioned were becoming a real concern, as reports reached us about raids on other shelters by desperate groups who had been turned away from established emergency centers. Armed bands were supposedly traveling between population centers, taking supplies and resources by force from communities that couldn't defend themselves effectively. Whether these reports were accurate or just rumors spread by frightened people, they were affecting decision-making and creating an atmosphere of suspicion and defensive planning. Janet Morrison called another community meeting to address these tensions, but the discussion quickly revealed how divided we had become about fundamental questions of priorities and survival strategies. About half the residents supported continued investment in psychological services, educational activities, and community-building efforts that they saw as essential for long-term survival. The other half wanted to eliminate everything except basic life support functions and focus all resources on immediate physical needs. The debate became personal when several parents stood up to describe how toys and play activities had helped their children adapt to shelter life and maintain emotional stability during the crisis. Sarah Martinez talked about her daughter Lucy learning woodworking skills that might be valuable for future survival needs. The Thompson family explained how their twins had stopped fighting constantly after getting individual sets of building blocks. Mrs. Williams, Marcus's mother, said that the spinning top I had made for her son had given him joy during his final days, and that she was grateful he had experienced beauty and wonder even in the midst of catastrophe. But other residents responded with stories about children who had died in failed shelters, that had wasted resources on non-essential activities, instead of focusing on medical care and food security. They argued that Marcus Williams might still be alive if the antibiotics we couldn't afford had been prioritized over materials used for toy making. They questioned whether any child's psychological comfort was worth risking another preventable death due to inadequate supplies. The meeting ended without resolution, but with an agreement to implement new resource allocation procedures that would require all non-essential activities to be approved by a committee that included both original residents and newer arrivals. In practice, this meant that my work would be subject to ongoing scrutiny and potential elimination if conditions worsened, or if community opinion shifted further toward strict survival priorities. I spent the next few days working as quickly as possible to complete toys that had already been requested, uncertain about whether I would have access to materials for future projects. The political climate in the shelter was becoming unstable in ways that reminded me of stories my grandfather had told about wartime communities, where survival pressures had led to conflicts between neighbors who had previously cooperated peacefully. The crisis came to a head on August 26th, when the delayed supply convoy that we had been hoping would reach us finally made radio contact with devastating news. They had been forced to turn back after discovering that the roads between Portland and their supply depot had become completely impassable due to ice storms and abandoned vehicles. More critically, they reported that supply centers throughout the region were being overwhelmed by refugee populations and were suspending deliveries to established shelters in order to focus on emergency relief for people who were still traveling in dangerous conditions. We were completely on our own. The food rationing that had already reduced our daily intake to minimal survival levels would have to be cut even further. Heating fuel consumption would need to be reduced despite temperatures that were continuing to drop below anything recorded in regional history. Medical supplies that were already inadequate for treating minor injuries and illnesses would have to last indefinitely with number prospect of replacement. The announcement triggered panic reactions that had been building under the surface for weeks. Some families immediately began hoarding whatever food and supplies they could collect, hiding resources in their sleeping areas instead of contributing to community stores. Others started making plans to leave the shelter entirely, believing they would have better survival chances in smaller groups that could move more quickly and required fewer resources. Arguments broke out about whether to accept any additional refugees or to bar the doors and defend what we had against all newcomers. Robert Chen used the crisis to renew his campaign against non-essential activities, arguing that every scrap of material and every minute of labor needed to be devoted to immediate survival needs. He organized a petition demanding that toy making be suspended immediately, and that all wood scraps be saved for emergency fuel if our heating system failed. The petition gained support from about a third of the shelter residents, mostly people who had arrived recently and were focused on short-term survival rather than long-term community building. But the petition also triggered a counter-response from families who had seen firsthand how toys and play activities contributed to their children's ability to cope with shelter life. They organized their own petition supporting continued investment in psychological services and developmental activities, arguing that children who maintained emotional stability were less demanding of parental attention and community resources. Dr. Martinez provided documentation showing that families with access to toys and structured play were experiencing fewer medical emergencies and behavioral crises than those without such support. The community was splitting into factions that might not be able to coexist peacefully if conditions continued to deteriorate. I found myself caught in the middle of a political battle that was really about deeper questions of what kind of society we were trying to create and maintain under impossible circumstances. Were we just trying to keep as many people alive as possible for as long as possible? Or were we trying to preserve something recognizably human and civilized that would be worth rebuilding when the crisis eventually ended? The breaking point came on August 29th, when a group of about 50 refugees arrived at our doors after walking for 3 days from a failed shelter in Beaverton. They were in terrible condition, suffering from frostbite and malnutrition, and several of their children required immediate medical attention that we were barely equipped to provide. But accepting them would push our population over 2,500 people and would exhaust our remaining food supplies within a week instead of the 10 days we had been hoping to stretch them. Janet Morrison and the shelter leadership spent hours in emergency session trying to decide whether to admit the new refugees or to turn them away. The debate was agonizing because everyone understood that rejecting them meant condemning them to almost certain death in the sub-zero temperatures outside. But accepting them might doom the entire shelter community to starvation within days rather than weeks. In the end, the decision was made to admit the Beaverton refugees, but to implement immediate emergency rationing that reduced everyone's food intake to barely subsistence levels. All non-essential activities would be suspended indefinitely. All available materials would be reserved for emergency repairs and essential functions. Anyone who wanted to continue non-essential projects would need to do so with their own privately held resources without any community support. I was officially out of the toy-making business, at least as far as community recognition and material support were concerned. But I still had my grandfather's tools and the small stockpile of wood scraps and fabric pieces I had been saving for exactly this kind of emergency. More importantly, I still had children in the shelter who needed comfort and hope and reasons to believe that adults cared about their happiness as well as their survival. That night, as I worked by candlelight on a small wooden horse for one of the newly arrived Beaverton children, I realized that I was no longer making toys for a community that supported my work. I was making them as an act of resistance against the idea that survival required abandoning everything that made life worth living. Lucy Martinez was still learning woodworking techniques in secret, using scraps she collected during her assigned cleaning duties. The Thompson twins were still playing quietly with their blocks instead of fighting and disturbing other families. Parents were still approaching me quietly, asking if I could make something small and simple that might help their children sleep through the night without crying. The underground toy economy that developed over the next few days reminded me of stories my grandfather had told about resistance activities during wartime. People found ways to continue activities they valued despite official prohibitions and resource constraints. Children learned to hide their toys during inspections and to play quietly so they wouldn't attract attention from adults who might confiscate anything that seemed non-essential. Parents traded food rations and personal belongings for carved animals and wooden puzzles that they believed were worth the sacrifice. But I was also seeing signs that our community unity was breaking down in more serious ways. Families were forming alliances based on their survival philosophies and resource-sharing agreements. People were starting to talk openly about leaving the shelter to form smaller groups that would be more manageable and less politically complicated. Others were discussing the possibility of defending our current position by force if necessary, preventing additional refugees from entering and protecting our remaining supplies from potential raids. The temperature outside had dropped to 20 degrees below zero during the day and 40 below at night. Anyone who left the shelter would be taking enormous risks just from exposure. Never mind the challenges of finding food, shelter, and heating fuel in a landscape where normal supply systems had completely collapsed. But staying together was becoming increasingly difficult as resources dwindled, and people were forced to make harder choices about what they were willing to sacrifice for community survival. On September 1st, exactly 35 days after I had first entered the Moda Center, 3 families announced they were leaving to attempt the journey to relatives in eastern Oregon, where they believed conditions might be better. The families included 9 adults and 6 children, and they were taking their share of remaining food supplies, along with whatever warm clothing and equipment they could carry. Other residents tried to convince them that leaving was suicide, but they were determined to take their chances rather than wait for inevitable starvation in an overcrowded shelter. I spent their last night in the shelter carving small wooden tokens for each of the children who were leaving, tiny animals that could fit in coat pockets and might provide some comfort during what would certainly be a terrifying journey. The parents were grateful, but also guilty about accepting anything that used materials other people might need. Everyone understood that we might never know whether they survived or what happened to them after they disappeared into the frozen landscape outside Portland. The next morning, as I watched those 6 children walk out into conditions that would have been deadly even for experienced wilderness travelers with proper equipment, I realized that the crisis was entering a new phase that would test everything we thought we knew about survival and community and the value of human life. The question was no longer whether we could maintain normal activities like toy making alongside essential survival tasks. The question was whether we could maintain our humanity while making choices that would determine who lived and who died among people we had come to care about as family. And I still had 43 children in the shelter who needed reasons to believe that tomorrow might be better than today, even when the evidence suggested that tomorrow would be colder and harder and more dangerous than anything they had experienced so far. My work was becoming more important and more impossible at the same time, and I was running out of materials and time and community support, just when the need for what I did was becoming more desperate than ever. But I kept carving anyway, because the alternative was giving up on the idea that children deserved comfort and wonder, even when the world was ending around them. And because Lucy Martinez was still learning to use my grandfather's tools, still believing that knowing how to make beautiful things with your hands was a skill that would matter in whatever world we were creating from the ashes of the old one. The heating system failed on September 3rd. Not gradually, not with warning signs we could prepare for, but completely and catastrophically during the coldest night we had experienced since the crisis began. I woke up around 3 in the morning to the sound of parents frantically trying to warm crying children with their own body heat, and the terrible silence where the constant hum of the heating units should have been. The temperature inside the arena dropped to just above freezing within hours. Outside, it was 45 degrees below zero, cold enough to kill an exposed person in minutes. Old Pete and a team of volunteers worked desperately to diagnose the problem. But the heating system had been jury-rigged so many times to accommodate our growing population that it had finally reached the point where essential components simply couldn't handle the stress anymore. Janet Morrison called an emergency meeting at dawn, but it was really just a formality to announce what everyone already understood. We had maybe 12 hours before the arena became uninhabitable. The backup heating units we had been saving for exactly this kind of emergency weren't powerful enough to heat the entire space, and we didn't have enough fuel to run them for more than a few days anyway. We needed to find a way to make our living space much smaller and much more energy efficient, or we needed to evacuate to somewhere else that could provide adequate shelter. But there was nowhere else to go. Every other major shelter in the Portland area had either closed due to similar heating failures or had stopped accepting new residents because they were already beyond capacity. The convention center downtown was supposedly still operating, but reports from people who had tried to reach it suggested that the situation there was chaotic and dangerous, with inadequate security and resources. Smaller emergency sites were closing daily as their limited resources were exhausted. The solution that emerged from desperate brainstorming was both ingenious and terrifying. We would abandon most of the arena and concentrate everyone into the smallest space that could be effectively heated with our remaining fuel and backup equipment. That meant moving 2,400 people into an area designed for maybe 300, eliminating almost all privacy and personal space, and creating living conditions that would test every limit of human cooperation and endurance. The area we chose was the former restaurant kitchen and adjoining storage rooms, spaces that were already partially insulated and had lower ceilings that would be easier to heat efficiently. But moving everyone into such a confined space also meant making brutal decisions about what possessions people could keep and what would have to be abandoned. Each family was allowed one backpack of essential items. Everything else would be left behind in the frozen arena, including most of the toys and comfort items that had helped children cope with shelter life. I had maybe 2 hours to decide what to save from my workshop area and what to leave behind forever. My grandfather's tools were the obvious choice, along with a small selection of the best wood scraps and the few completed toys that weren't already with children. But I also made a decision that surprised me. I took apart the puppet theater that old Pete and I had built, carefully removing the hardware and folding the fabric components into the smallest possible bundle. Something told me that entertainment and community gathering would become even more important in the cramped conditions we were moving into. The relocation process was chaos. Families carrying crying children and overstuffed backpacks tried to claim floor space in rooms that were already crowded beyond any reasonable capacity. Arguments broke out as people discovered that the spaces they thought they had been assigned were already occupied by other families. The noise level was overwhelming, with hundreds of conversations happening simultaneously in enclosed areas where every sound echoed and amplified. But something unexpected happened during those first horrible hours in our new living situation. People started cooperating in ways they hadn't when resources and space had been more abundant. Families began sharing floor space and organizing sleeping arrangements that maximized everyone's comfort within the severe constraints. Parents worked together to establish quiet times and activity schedules that would prevent the confined space from becoming completely chaotic. Children who had been fighting over toys started playing cooperatively because there simply wasn't room for individual possessions or territorial behavior. Dr. Martinez called it survival psychology, the way extreme circumstances sometimes brought out people's capacity for cooperation rather than competition. She said it was similar to what happened in natural disasters, where communities that faced genuine existential threats often became more unified and supportive than they had been during normal times. But she also warned that this kind of cooperation was fragile and might not last if conditions continued to deteriorate, or if people started to believe that survival required choosing between competing groups. My new workshop space was a corner of the former food storage room, maybe 6 feet by 4 feet, barely large enough for me to sit cross-legged with my tools spread around me. But it was warm, and it was mine, and children could still find me when they needed something carved or repaired. The first request came from Lucy Martinez, who asked if I could fix a wooden doll that had been damaged during the relocation. As I worked on the repair, she watched carefully and asked questions about technique, still determined to learn woodworking skills despite the chaos around us. The space limitations meant I had to completely rethink my approach to toy making. Everything had to be smaller, simpler, and more efficient than anything I had made before. Tiny carved animals that could fit in a child's pocket, simple puzzles made from single pieces of wood with slots cut to hold small objects, whistles and spinning tops that required minimal material but could provide maximum engagement and distraction. But I also started making things that weren't exactly toys, items that served multiple purposes and could justify their existence even to the most survival-focused residents. Wooden spoons that were carved with decorative handles that children enjoyed holding. Small containers that could store precious personal items but were also beautiful enough to provide aesthetic pleasure. Combs and hair ornaments that served practical grooming needs while giving their owners something lovely to touch and look at. Old Pete had claimed a workshop space next to mine, and we resumed our collaboration on projects that combined his mechanical knowledge with my woodworking skills. But now we were focused on items that addressed immediate survival needs while still providing some comfort and psychological benefit. A hand crank can opener that was decorated with carved designs. Wooden buttons to replace metal ones that were being damaged by the extreme cold. Small tools and utensils that were both functional and pleasant to use. The confined living conditions created problems that no one had anticipated during the planning process. Privacy was essentially eliminated, with families sleeping within arm's reach of strangers and personal conversations becoming impossible to keep confidential. Hygiene became a major challenge as bathroom facilities designed for occasional use were overwhelmed by constant demand from thousands of people. Food preparation and distribution required complex coordination to avoid accidents and conflicts in spaces that weren't designed for that kind of activity. But children adapted to the new conditions faster than adults, probably because their smaller size made the cramped quarters feel less oppressive, and because they were more accustomed to sharing space and resources. They invented games that could be played in minimal areas and created social structures that helped them navigate the complex dynamics of living so closely with so many other families. The toys I was making became even more important as tools for managing behavior and providing comfort in conditions that were testing everyone's patience and emotional stability. On September 8th, 5 days after the heating system failure, we faced our next major crisis. 2 children developed fevers and respiratory symptoms that Dr. Martinez was afraid might be pneumonia. In our overcrowded conditions, with people sleeping so close together and sharing limited bathroom facilities, any infectious disease could spread rapidly through the entire population. We didn't have adequate medical supplies to treat serious illnesses, and we certainly didn't have space to quarantine sick people effectively. The sick children were 4-year-old Michael Santos and 6-year-old Rebecca Johnson, both from families that had arrived during the refugee influx in late August. Their parents were terrified, remembering Marcus Williams and understanding that children could die quickly from conditions that should have been easily treatable with proper medical care. Dr. Martinez did everything she could with the limited supplies available, but everyone understood that we were essentially hoping for the best while preparing for the worst. The crisis forced another community discussion about priorities and resource allocation, but this time, the conversation was different. People weren't arguing about whether toys and comfort items were justifiable luxuries. They were talking about whether we could afford to care for sick people who might die anyway, and whether the resources used to treat them could be better spent on preventing illness in the healthy population. It was a conversation that revealed how far we had traveled from normal ethical frameworks towards survival calculations that would have been unthinkable 3 months earlier. I found myself advocating for continued medical care for the sick children, not just because it was the right thing to do, but because communities that abandoned their most vulnerable members were unlikely to maintain the cooperation and trust that all of us needed to survive. If we started making decisions about who deserved care based on their likelihood of survival, we would quickly find ourselves in a situation where everyone was competing rather than collaborating, and where the strong were exploiting the weak instead of protecting them. The debate was interrupted by news that changed everyone's perspective on our situation. Radio contact with a group of survivors in Bend, Oregon had brought reports that conditions in eastern Oregon were significantly better than what we were experiencing in Portland. The volcanic cooling effect was less severe at higher elevations and in areas that were further from the ocean. Temperatures were still below normal, but not at the life-threatening levels we were dealing with. More importantly, agricultural communities in that region were still producing some food, and there were reports of organized refugee settlements that were accepting new residents. The information triggered intense discussions about whether some or all of our population should attempt to reach eastern Oregon. The journey would be extremely dangerous, covering more than 100 miles through mountain terrain in conditions that had already proven deadly for experienced travelers. But staying in Portland meant facing probable starvation and certain death if our heating system couldn't be permanently repaired before winter conditions became even more severe. Some families immediately began planning to leave, calculating that the risks of traveling were better than the certainty of slow death in an overcrowded shelter with inadequate resources. Others argued that splitting up the community would doom everyone, that our only chance for survival was to pool all our resources and knowledge to find solutions to our current problems. The debate became increasingly heated as people realized that this decision would probably determine who lived and who died among people they had come to care about as family. Janet Morrison tried to maintain community unity by organizing systematic planning for both options. Volunteers would research travel routes and requirements for reaching eastern Oregon safely. Other teams would continue working on solutions to our heating and resource problem that might make staying in Portland viable for extended periods. But everyone understood that we probably didn't have enough time or resources to pursue both strategies effectively. I was torn between the competing options in ways that reflected my larger struggle with balancing idealism and practical survival needs. Staying in Portland meant continuing the work I had been doing with children and families, maintaining the relationships and community structures that had given meaning to my life during the crisis. But it also meant accepting conditions that were becoming increasingly desperate and might ultimately prove unsurvivable for many of the people I cared about. Leaving for eastern Oregon meant abandoning everything we had built together and taking enormous risks for uncertain benefits. But it also meant the possibility of finding a place where children could grow up with adequate food and shelter, where families could maintain some privacy and personal autonomy, and where the work I did might contribute to rebuilding something resembling normal life, rather than just helping people endure gradually worsening conditions. The decision was made for many of us on September 12th, when old Pete successfully rigged a temporary repair to the heating system that brought the temperature in our confined living space back to barely tolerable levels. The repair used most of our remaining spare parts and wouldn't last more than a few weeks, but it bought us time to make more careful plans and to wait for updated information about conditions in eastern Oregon. Michael Santos and Rebecca Johnson recovered from their illnesses, probably because they were stronger than Marcus Williams had been, and because Dr. Martinez had learned more about treating childhood diseases with limited resources. Their recovery improved community morale and reinforced arguments for staying in Portland, rather than taking the risks associated with long-distance travel. But it also reminded everyone that we were completely dependent on luck and improvisation for medical care, and that the next child who got sick might not be so fortunate. Over the next few days, I found myself working more intensively than I had since the early days of my workshop, but on projects that were completely different from anything I had done before. Instead of individual toys for specific children, I was making items that could serve entire families or groups of families. A chess set carved from scrap wood that could provide entertainment for adults as well as children during the long hours when there was nothing else to do. A set of measuring cups and spoons that were both functional and decorative, bringing some beauty to the tedious tasks of food preparation and rationing. But the most important project was rebuilding the puppet theater in our new confined space. Working with Lucy Martinez and several other children who had learned basic woodworking skills, I created a smaller version that could be set up and taken down quickly without requiring permanent installation. The puppet shows became a focal point for community gathering, providing entertainment that brought families together and created shared experiences that helped maintain morale during the darkest periods. Lucy had become my unofficial apprentice, learning techniques with remarkable speed, and demonstrating a natural talent for both carving and mechanical problem-solving. She was only 6 years old, but she was already creating simple toys on her own and helping me with complex projects that required multiple hands and careful coordination. Her enthusiasm and skill were inspiring other children to learn practical crafts, creating an informal education system that prepared them for a world where making things by hand would be essential for survival. On September 15th, we received news that fundamentally changed how everyone thought about our long-term prospects. Radio contact with Seattle brought reports that the federal government was organizing massive evacuation and relocation programs for affected populations throughout the Pacific Northwest. Military transport would be provided for civilians who wanted to relocate to emergency settlements in the Southwest, where conditions were more favorable and resources were more abundant. The evacuations would begin within weeks, and transportation would be provided free of charge for anyone who wanted to participate. The announcement triggered the most intense community debate we had experienced since the crisis began. Federal evacuation meant the possibility of reaching areas with adequate food, shelter, and medical care, places where children could attend schools and families could begin rebuilding normal lives. But it also meant abandoning Portland permanently and accepting placement in refugee camps that might be overcrowded and poorly administered. It meant giving up any control over where we would live and what kind of community we would be part of. Some residents immediately began preparing to take advantage of the evacuation opportunities, viewing them as the answer to prayers they had been afraid to voice. Others were suspicious of government promises and worried about what kind of conditions they might find in federal refugee settlements. Still others had developed such strong attachments to our shelter community that they couldn't imagine starting over somewhere else with strangers who didn't share our experiences and values. I found myself thinking about Emma Rodriguez and her rocking horse, about Marcus Williams and his spinning top, about all the children who had died during the past 3 months, while adults struggled to create safe spaces for them to grow up. The federal evacuation offered the possibility that surviving children might have real futures, instead of just extended survival in gradually worsening conditions. But it also meant leaving behind everything we had learned about cooperation and resilience, abandoning the relationships and structures that had given meaning to our struggle. The decision deadline was still weeks away, but people were already beginning to divide into groups based on their evacuation plans. Families who intended to relocate were starting to distance themselves emotionally from shelter life, treating current arrangements as temporary inconveniences rather than community commitments. Those who planned to stay were beginning to view the potential departures as betrayals of loyalty and shared sacrifice. I spent the next few days working on what might be my final projects in the shelter that had been my home for more than 2 months. A complete set of wooden animals for the children who would be staying, carved with extra care and attention, because they might need to last for years in whatever conditions we would face next. A tool kit for Lucy Martinez that included small versions of my grandfather's most essential carving implements, along with detailed instructions carved into wooden tablets that would preserve the techniques I had taught her. But I was also making preparations for the possibility that I might join the federal evacuation, creating portable versions of my most important tools and selecting materials that could be easily transported if I decided to start over somewhere else. The uncertainty was perhaps the most difficult part of the whole experience, not knowing whether the relationships and work that had sustained me through the crisis would continue, or whether I would soon be starting completely over with strangers in an unknown place. On September 18th, exactly 90 days after I had first entered the Moda Center with my grandfather's tools and a bag of wood scraps, I made my decision about the federal evacuation. I would stay in Portland with the families who had become my community, continuing the work that had given purpose to my life during the crisis. The children who had learned woodworking from me deserved to have that knowledge preserved and expanded, regardless of what conditions we might face in the future. The parents who had supported my work during the debates about priorities and resource allocation had earned my loyalty in return. But I was also staying because I had learned something important about the relationship between survival and meaning during those 90 days. People could endure incredible hardships and deprivations as long as they had reasons to believe that their struggles served purposes larger than just staying alive. Children could adapt to almost any conditions as long as they had adults who cared about their happiness and development as well as their physical safety. Communities could maintain cooperation and mutual support through the worst crises, as long as they preserved activities and values that reminded them what they were trying to preserve. The world had ended, but people were still people, and children still needed reasons to believe that being human meant more than just biological survival. My grandfather had been right about the importance of wonder and beauty, even when wonder seemed impossible and beauty felt like a luxury no one could afford, especially then when the alternatives were despair and the gradual abandonment of everything that made life worth living. They say it takes 90 days to form a new habit. It took me exactly that long to understand that when the world freezes over, the most important thing isn't staying warm, it's staying human. And sometimes, the difference between those two things is a simple wooden toy carved by someone who still believes children deserve wonder, even when wonder seems impossible. Especially then. 90 days. From the last normal morning in my workshop on Southeast Hawthorne Boulevard to this moment, in a converted restaurant kitchen where 42 children are learning that adults still care about their happiness, even when happiness has become the hardest thing in the world to create. From Emma Rodriguez asking when summer would come back to Lucy Martinez learning to carve her own answers to questions that don't have solutions anymore. The federal evacuation buses will arrive next week. Some families will leave, believing they can find better lives in refugee settlements hundreds of miles away. Others will stay, convinced that the community we've built together is worth preserving regardless of what conditions we face next winter. The choice will tear apart relationships that were forged in crisis and tested by circumstances none of us could have imagined 3 months ago. But the children will still need toys, and parents will still need reasons to hope, and communities will still need people who remember that survival without meaning is just a slower way of dying. There will always be work for someone who knows how to carve comfort from chaos, who understands that a child holding a wooden animal feels safer than a child with empty hands, who believes that the future belongs to people who preserve beauty and wonder, even when the world tells them such things are impossible luxuries. The ice age isn't ending anytime soon. The volcanic ash in the atmosphere will block sunlight for years, maybe decades. The children growing up in this frozen world will face challenges that previous generations never had to imagine. But they'll also have opportunities to build something better than what existed before, to create communities based on cooperation rather than competition, to value making things with their hands instead of just consuming what others produce. And somewhere in that future world, there will be workshops where patient adults teach eager children how to transform raw wood into objects of beauty and utility. There will be families gathering around handmade toys that connect them to traditions of craftsmanship and care that survived the end of one world and helped birth another. There will be communities that understand that preserving humanity requires more than just keeping people alive. That's what I learned during my first 90 days of survival when summer died forever. That's what I'll be teaching for however many days I have left, in whatever world we manage to create from the frozen remnants of the old one.